Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we have an incredible, mind-expanding video. I've often been intrigued by the star forts found in America. I've often wondered where they came from. What was the history behind them? So I decided to make a comprehensive video, a list, showcasing every star fortification that ever existed on United States soil. And this is according to the current narrative. So we'll be looking at photographs of each, the oldest images that I could find, and just a little bit of information about them as well. Let's begin. Many may think that this is a European design, and the history of the star fort does lend itself back to much of the current narrative Renaissance period. But when we dive further into it, we will actually come to find that in this current narrative, we're told that star forts were no longer being built or being used in the late 17, early 1800s is really when they were discontinued, so to speak, in Europe. And yet, when we come to America, the fledgling country of the United States, we find that after really the War of Independence and through the War of 1812 and through the Civil War and even into World War I, we have these star fortifications still being founded, still being built all across the United States. So for now, we're looking at the assortment of star forts that I found all across the world. These are such unique structures that would take such meticulous planning. The architecture alone, what they would have to do to transform the landscape. One can only imagine how these star forts were truly constructed. And we're led to believe that in these small groups of engineers, of troops, they had the ability to coordinate these massive events of building these star fortifications. So we will look at the star forts that were rising in the United States in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And again, this video is just food for thought, so take everything you see with a grain of salt. Before beginning this list, for each fort, I will give you a brief summary of the current narrative history, as well as providing you with any pre-1900 photographs I could find, and modern images where applicable, to give you a better understanding of the fortification in question. To better establish the basis for this ingenuity, we will first define a star fort. Right off the bat, something often skipped over in discussions of the star forts is that they were actually first employed, some say invented, in Italy by none other than Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and Renaissance man Michelangelo. Yes, that Michelangelo is credited with creating the star fort. We're told the necessity for the star fort arose with the development and further usage of cannons in the European medieval period. Ring-shaped fortifications built on raised land, usually tells or mounds, had been the commonplace for hundreds of years prior to the development of cannon usage in European warfare. Ring-shaped fortifications were easily penetrated and had many weak or difficult to guard locations. In contrast, the Bastion fortress, or the Star Fort, was a very flat structure composed of many triangular bastions, specifically designed to cover one another and to cover a ditch made to take the brunt of larger impacts. To counteract the cannonballs, the defensive walls of the Star Fort were made lower and thicker. To counteract the fact that lower walls were easy to climb, the ditches surrounding the layers of walls were widened so that attacking troops were still exposed. They were built of many different materials, but the star forts that have lasted until today were usually built of earth and brick, as we're told brick did not shatter on impact like stone. Bastion fortifications were further developed in Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries as a result of the French invasion of the Italian peninsula. The first known star fort existed in Florence, Italy, constructed by the aforementioned Michelangelo. The design then spread out of Italy in the 1530s and 1540s and was well known throughout Europe by the end of that century. Italian engineers were heavily in demand throughout Europe, leading to the founding and flourishing of many guilds that were related directly to star forts. The star-shaped fortification had a formative influence on the patterning of the Renaissance ideal city, and most major city projects at the time employed a star fortification as the principal center concept. Remarkably, we're told star forts, for all of their glory, fell out of usage by the beginning of the 19th century. And I quote, "In the 19th century, with the development of more powerful artillery and explosive shells, star forts were replaced by simpler but more robust square fortresses." End quote. With all that being said, let us now take a deep dive into the known star forts which existed or still exist in the United States of America, beginning with Fort Wayne in modern Detroit, Michigan. Fort Wayne is the third fort built on the area of Detroit, Michigan, and was constructed in 1848. The fort sits along the Detroit River and is constructed of limestone and brick. Fort Wayne sits on 96 acres of land, which was known to once house over 19 Indigenous American burial mounds, or mounds of the mound builders. Fort Wayne was constructed atop the largest of these mounds. The last remaining of the 19 burial mounds was excavated and lost in the early 20th century. The first engagement of the War of 1812 was said to have occurred on the Sandhill Mound, which became Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne still exists today. The second fort I'd like to look at is, and excuse my pronunciation, the Fort de Chartres in Randolph County, Illinois. The history here is absolutely wild. On January 1st, 1718, a trade monopoly was granted to John Law by the French monarchy to establish the Company of the West. The goal of the Company of the West was to make a fortune off of the New World, mainly in precious metals. The administration of the entire Illinois country, then French-owned, transferred from Quebec to New Orleans, and in such, the governance of the country was given to this Company of the West. From their new star fort, the Company of the West ran the Illinois country. Their series of wooden, palisaded forts was made permanent with the star fort you see now, which was built in 1753-1754. Or so you think. We're told the star fort originally encompassed 4 acres within its walls. The walls were 15 feet high and at least 3 feet thick. The stone was said to have been quarried over 3 miles away and hauled by boat to the site. Yet somehow, this administrative center for the French fell into disrepair under the British and was abandoned by the year 1772. For centuries following, the stones from the original Star Fort's walls were then taken and repurposed into nearby buildings until nothing was left of the Star Fort but the masonry powder magazine. This small, original masonry building still stands today and is considered the oldest building in all of Illinois. The Star Fort was then rebuilt by the state of Illinois for museum purposes in the early 1900s and still stands today. Next, we will look at Fort St. Anthony, also known as Fort Snelling, in unorganized territory of Minnesota. This ideal star fort overlooks the bluffs of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. The location on which this fort was built was known as the Meeting of the Waters to the Dakota people and served as a place of significant spiritual importance. In 1805, Zebulon Pike signed an unauthorized treaty granting himself and the United States the land taken from the Dakota, with no formal witnesses. Eventually, the United States would use this treaty as the auspices for construction of the Star Fort Snelling. The fort was constructed in the year 1818 and was home to many influential people who would eventually gain their freedom from slavery, including Harriet Robinson Scott and Dred Scott. The Star Fort Snelling simultaneously served in both the Civil War and was the main base of operations for the United States government in the Dakota War of 1862. The Star Fort again housed troops in both World Wars before being decommissioned in 1946. Fort Snelling then fell into disrepair, was renovated in 1965, reopened to the public, and is now run by the Minnesota Historical Society. It still stands today. One of the most amazing aspects of looking at this particular star fort was the ability I had to find the stereoscopic or old world 3D photographs. And you can see that the star fort situated here on the bluffs is absolutely some of the most incredible architecture I have seen from this time period. But let me know what you think down below. For the next few forts, we're going to be traveling into the state of Maryland. We will begin with Fort Marshall. This short-lived fort, which I could not find any photographs of, was said to have been built at the onset of the Civil War in 1861 to defend Baltimore from coastal attacks. What makes this even more interesting, we're told Lieutenant Colonel Henry Brewerton was charged with strengthening Baltimore's defenses. Not only did he construct Fort Marshall, but he also constructed at least 2 more brand new star forts named Fort Federal Hill and Fort Worthington, both of which I could also find no photographs of. We're told Fort Marshall was constructed atop a geological feature known as Snake Hill, which by many accounts was a burial mound or another type of earlier earthwork. We're told in the narrative that Fort Marshall was both Baltimore's most important fort during the Civil War, but was also never involved in any battles. And by the year 1864, still during the Civil War, this fort was considered to be a Union hospital. By May of 1866, the entire Star Fort Marshal was closed down, stripped, and what remained of the Star Fort was quite literally sold at auction. We're told much of the materials were then purchased by the newly founded Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. If that name doesn't speak volumes about what was happening in America, I'm not sure what will. A Star Fort built on top of an indigenous earthwork, never used in battle, then torn apart, and everything found inside the fort is sold to the highest bidder, who just so happens to be a government agency in charge of monitoring abandoned lands. The next fort we're going to look at is actually currently a state park in Big Pool, Maryland, but the park is based around the earlier Star Fort known as Fort Frederick. Star Fort Frederick was built in 1756 through 1757 by the colony of Maryland. Incredibly, we're told this fort was not built for defense, but rather was built as an intricate refugee camp for settlers looking to head into indigenous territories. The fort was not designed to resist artillery, as it was correctly assumed that the French would not be able to transport artillery to this remote location. However, unexplainably, the not defensive structure was still founded as a Star Fort. The fort housed troops during Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, but was never attacked. It never saw battle. Fort Frederick housed over 1,000 prisoners during the American War for Independence, seemingly indicating just how vast and expansive Fort Frederick truly was. The fort that exists today is a massive stone rectangle with large bastions at each corner. Each curtain wall is roughly 180 feet long and over 17 feet tall, with walls at least 3 feet thick, while the bastions, each projecting 100 feet, have walls that are at least 4.5 feet thick. Again, we're told Fort Frederick, this mysterious, massive Star Fort, was sold at auction in 1791, stripped of all materials, and sat empty until the Civil War. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was built parallel to this Star Fort. In 1861, the 1st Maryland Infantry occupied Fort Frederick, defending it on Christmas Day of that same year. By 1862, Fort Frederick was again abandoned. The fort, like many other Star Forts, had its stones reused in other nearby buildings. In 1922, the dilapidated Fort Frederick was purchased by the state of Maryland and transformed into Maryland's first state park. The Star Fort was rebuilt again at this time and still stands today. Next, we will go back to the coastal defenses of the massive city of Baltimore, looking at the most famous Star Fort, many would say, in America, Fort McHenry. This is one of the most well-known Star Forts in all of the world, both because of its visual splendor and also for the role that it served in the War of 1812. We're told Fort McHenry was constructed in 1798 by Frenchman Jean Foncin near Locust Point and was occupied continuously by American forces through World War II, serving the armed forces of America for well over 100 years, even after being designated as a national park in 1925 and as a national monument in 1939. Fort McHenry was the location where the national anthem of America took shape, as during the War of 1812, an American storm flag flew over the Great Star Fort. The flag was eventually replaced in victory on September 14, 1814, with an American garrison flag, and this event, signaling American victory in the Battle of Baltimore, was witnessed by Francis Scott Key, who put what he saw into the words that would become the national anthem, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Interestingly, Fort McHenry served as a military prison during the Civil War, and one of the inmates housed was the grandson of Francis Scott Key, Francis Key Howard. The Star Fort McHenry also still stands in much of its original glory today. However, many don't realize that Fort McHenry was quite literally built out of the ashes and on the foundation of Fort Whetstone, which was built in 1776. This sprawling fortress is known as Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas National Park. Not only is this one of the most remote star forts in all of America, situated roughly 68 miles off the coast of Key West, but Fort Jefferson is actually the largest brick masonry structure in the entire Western Hemisphere, being constructed of over 16 million bricks encompassing an area of over 16 acres. The history here is equally fascinating. According to the current narrative, Fort Jefferson began as a concept by Commodore David Porter to build a fort to protect the Caribbean from piracy. Inspecting the Dry Tortugas Islands, Porter was unimpressed, and in the year 1825 he reported that the landscape was uninhabitable. However, a lighthouse, which is now known as the Garden Key Light, was constructed by the year 1826 against the wishes of Porter. The lighthouse was apparently whitewashed upon completion and made to look significantly older. A second survey under Commodore John Rogers in the vessel known as Florida reported the Dry Tortugas as a perfect location for a fort, due in part to the natural inner and outer harbors. John Rogers presented this idea by 1829. However, it wasn't until the year 1845 when United States Army Captain Robert E. Lee, the same Robert E. Lee who would go on to lead the Confederate Army, recommended to Thomas Blake that a fort be constructed in the Dry Tortugas region. Construction first began on the fort surrounding the lighthouse, which the fort was said to have been built around. The existing Garden Key Lighthouse and the lighthouse keeper's cottage were contained within the walls of the Star Fort. Construction was said to have began in 1846. However, the operation was said to have taken many decades, and we're told after a series of shifts in architectural designs, the Star Fort Jefferson was only about halfway complete by the year 1860. However, the fort was also said to have been almost completed by 1861 as it was being utilized during the Civil War. We have evidence that slave labor was used, and the fort was still under some sort of construction by the year 1863. By 1876, a new lighthouse was constructed from, quote, industrial strength metal, and by 1877, the original lighthouse, which the entire Fort Jefferson was built to protect, was actually torn down. The Star Fort Jefferson is six-sided, with two sides of 325 feet in length and the other four sides of roughly 477 feet in length. We're told all 16 million bricks were the responsibility of the Pensacola firm known as Rayford and Abercrombie. To provide ample fresh water, the entire fort is fitted with intricate cisterns. A further seawall was also completed in 1872. However, by 1874, we're told frequent hurricanes made Fort Jefferson nearly inhospitable. By 1889, it was abandoned and handed over to the Marine Hospital Service. By 1895, it was said to have been stripped by vandals and laid empty. Fort Jefferson then saw a brief resurgence in the Spanish-American War of 1898 before being given to the Navy in 1902, abandoned again by 1906, and by the year 1910, Fort Jefferson was considered a haunt for local fishermen and was almost entirely overgrown. Unknown to the public around this time, Fort Jefferson was actually a secret base for naval seaplane communications during World War I, but remained a ruin until roughly 1934. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt designated Fort Jefferson as a national monument, and at this time, it was meticulously restored. Fort Jefferson, the Star Fort, still stands today. Next, we will look at the Star Fort, known as Fort Zachary Taylor, again in Florida, on the southern tip of Key West. Fort Zachary Taylor was built in 1845 and now serves as a National Historic Landmark. The Bastion Fort is considered to be Civil War era, however, it actually predates the war by well over a decade. Thomas Island was selected as the location to extend the United States' new series of star forts in the South following the War of 1812. We're told this fort was designed by Simon Bernard and Joseph G. Cotton in the year 1836. However, it took until 1845 for the construction to begin, with the fort then opening officially in November of 1850, being named Fort Zachary Taylor after the president who had passed away in office just a few months earlier. We're told between Fort Zachary Taylor and the mentioned earlier Fort Jefferson, the United States Army Corps of Engineers brought well over 400 enslaved people to the Florida Keys, who would then remain there after these two forts were completed. Fort Zachary Taylor was absolutely massive, with the walls being 50 feet tall, over 5 feet thick, and the three seaward walls, known as curtains, each measured roughly 495 feet in length. The fort also included a 1,200-foot causeway, which connected the fort to the dry land. Fort Zachary Taylor also had massive cisterns around the fort for providing fresh water. Amazingly, the same company that produced over 16 million bricks for Fort Jefferson are also said to have provided millions of bricks for Fort Zachary Taylor at the exact same time, begging the question, how large truly was the firm of Rayford and Abercrombie to be able to produce well over 20 million bricks? By 1898, the massive 50-foot tall fort was reduced in size and made to stand only 2 stories tall. We're told Star Fort Zachary Taylor was used throughout the Spanish-American War, both World Wars, and even used during the Cuban Missile Crisis, before being shut down shortly thereafter. Remarkably, by 1968, Fort Zachary Taylor was excavated and discovered within its ruins to house the nation's largest collection of lost Civil War era technology. It was all buried under layers of mud in long forgotten portions of this star fort. The fort was then meticulously cleared, added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1971, and made a National Historic Landmark in 1973. The Fort Zachary Taylor still stands today and is used mainly as a museum and also a fort for Civil War reenactments. The next star fort to be discovered within the United States is the long-lost fortress of Fort Lee in Salem, Massachusetts. I say long-lost because this location today is almost entirely overgrown, and yet, if the current narrative is to be believed, Star Fort Lee has remained relatively untouched for the last 200 years. We're told Fort Lee is situated on the Salem Neck in Massachusetts. The Salem Neck has an oral history of being fortified since pre-European arrival to the area. However, Fort Lee is the first documented fort on this location. Fort Lee was an irregular-shaped, five-sided star fort, built mostly from earthworks and light usage of bricks. Interestingly, we're told the original earthworks making out the star fort still survive today. However, we also have an original building, a masonry stone powder magazine, which dates back to at least 1776. The entire Star Fort Lee was apparently rebuilt less than 2 decades after being first constructed and was heavily repaired during the 1790s. We're told from Salem records that Fort Lee has not been officially occupied, cleared, or built on top of since the 1790s, last serving in battle during the War of 1812 and last being garrisoned officially in the Spanish-American War of the late 1800s. However, Fort Lee was federalized the whole way back in 1867 and then transferred from federal control to the city of Salem in 1922. Attempts were made to fully clear the Star Fort Lee in 1976, but these attempts failed, and the fort is again overgrown and nearly unrecognizable. The Bastion Fort Lee was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1994, and the original earthworks, if you can find them beneath all of the rubble and debris, as well as the stone magazine, still stand today. The next fort you may be familiar with already. I have visited this fort, and many of you may have seen this fort or traversed this beautiful castle if you've played the game Fallout 4. This is, of course, Fort Independence, located on Castle Island in Boston, Massachusetts. Castle Island was actually an island off the coast of Boston until 1928, when it was connected to the mainland, making it a peninsula. The location of Fort Independence is one of the oldest continuously occupied communities in America and dates back hundreds of years before the island was connected to the mainland. The original structure built here, known as the castle, dates back to 1634. Remarkably, from the rise of this 1634 castle came at least 2 enlargements of the castle. The castle was first known as Castle William and became a massive star fort, which was eventually abandoned by the British during the United States War for Independence. The United States then seized the star fort almost immediately, renaming it Fort Independence in 1799. However, this star fort was previously the known hideaway for British troops for many years and many conflicts, and this star fort was involved directly in both the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 and the Boston Massacre of 1770. In 1785, the government of Massachusetts designated the Star Fort as a prison, in which capacity it served Massachusetts until 1805. Today, the Star Fort you see is considered to be the third fort built on top of the foundations of the previous 2. This Star Fort was built beginning in 1833 as part of the larger third system of United States fortifications, seemingly indicating the inheriting and repurposing process had long been happening in this neck of the woods. We're told the current stone building is quite literally built around earlier red brick, which was revealed in 20th century excavations. Following the Civil War, Fort Independence gradually fell out of use, as its importance was reduced by more modern, non-star forts. Somehow, simpler forts were replacing these lavish ones. Frederick Law Olmsted, notorious landscape architect who had his hand in a slew of questionable aspects of the world's fairs, was brought into Boston to help reshape the city. His plan was to connect Castle Island to the mainland. Castle Island and Fort Independence were further developed through the late 1800s, serving the armed forces of America through the Second World War. In 1962, Castle Island and Fort Independence were permanently deeded to the state of Massachusetts. A folk story claims that a duel took place at Fort Independence on Christmas Day of 1817. Here, Robert Massey held a sword duel against Gustavus Drain, where Massey, who was said to have been beloved by his troops, was fatally wounded. Struck with grief and in a frenzy, this myth states that Drain was then walled in one of the walls of Fort Independence. One of the troops who served at Fort Independence just so happened to be Edgar Allan Poe, who was inspired by the story of Drain and Massey to write the Cask of Amontillado. Fort Independence, in a much restored fashion, still stands today. Fort Jackson in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, is an absolutely epic star fort that was said to have been built between the years 1822 and 1832, according to the current narrative. This multiple layered star fort was originally one of the most intricately designed star forts ever built on American soil. Fort Jackson is roughly 70 miles south of New Orleans and sits just across the Mississippi River from an even earlier star fort known as Fort St. Philip. It appears both star forts were constructed on important scouting locations for indigenous people, sites of previous burial mounds constructed by the mound builders of the Mississippi River. Fort St. Philip dates to 1746 and was supposedly built by the Spanish. Fort St. Philip defended New Orleans through the Civil War and was used as a tanning factory during the early 1900s. Fort Jackson, on the other hand, sitting just outside of Triumph, Louisiana, is the much more robust and substantial Bastion fortress. Originally, Fort Jackson was built under the advice of Andrew Jackson, and by the Civil War, Fort Jackson was Confederate controlled. Nearly 2 weeks is what it took for the Battle of Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, which began in 1862, that led to the fall of both of these star forts, and then they came under Union control. Under the Union, the fortresses were quickly rebuilt and reinforced. Fort Jackson remained in regular federal use until well after World War I, when it became a military training center. Fort Jackson was declared a national monument in 1960. However, it was also said to have been filled with mud at this time, and the history was largely lost. And I quote, "The fort area had become a jungle of mud-filled tunnels infested with snakes and flooded with water. The history was lost," end quote. Fort Jackson was heavily renovated after this discovery and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1967. This fort still stands today as a museum operated by the Plaquemines Parish Commission Council. This is one of the largest star forts in Louisiana. One of the most important star forts in United States history, Star Fort Monroe, today known as the Fort Monroe National Monument, was founded in Hampton, Virginia in 1819. Construction took nearly 15 years, but when completed, the site encompassed an area of over 560 acres within 170 historic buildings and installations. Fort Monroe is also complete with a massive moat. The Star Fort is the epitome of the Bastion fort type of defensive structure that was being founded in America, and Fort Monroe was charged with protecting not only the entire Chesapeake Bay, but was also constructed to protect the Potomac River waterways, which led to Washington, D.C., and the entirety of the waterways which led to Baltimore. In such, we are told Fort Monroe was the largest fort of any kind ever built in the entire United States. We're told the fortifications on this site date back to the earliest days of the colony of Virginia, and from the foundations of these earlier forts came Fort Monroe, which was completed alongside another significant fort known as Fort Wool, built on an artificial island across the channel from Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is considered the peak of the third system of United States fortifications, which included many of the star forts on our list. The fort served as the headquarters of the harbor defenses of the Chesapeake Bay, while also housing multiple military training schools throughout the years. Fort Monroe was officially deactivated in September of 2011 by Obama and designated as a national monument. Fort Monroe, in all of its glory and beauty, still stands today. Next, we will look at Fort Ontario in the city of Oswego in Oswego County, New York. Fort Ontario is now the centerpiece of the Fort Ontario State Historic Site. The fortified site encompasses a total of 36 acres and construction was completed, we're told, in the year 1839. However, Fort Ontario is located on high ground overlooking Lake Ontario, and a first fort was said to have been built here by the French. It was constructed on land that was considered sacred to the indigenous people who once called Lake Ontario home. The first fort was founded in 1755, and this fort was home to many indigenous people, including the Iroquois. For many years, Fort Ontario was known as the Fort of the Six Nations. Remarkably, a similar fort, also possibly a bastion or star fort, known as Fort Oswego, existed across Lake Ontario. Fort Oswego was built even earlier, in 1727, by the British to blockade French trade. Fort Oswego was completely destroyed in the French and Indian War of 1756, and the foundations were then incorporated into the city of Oswego. Fort Ontario, on the other hand, was first founded in 1755, destroyed, and then rebuilt by the British in 1759. This was the location where the treaty to end Pontiac's War was signed, and the fort was destroyed again in 1778. It was rebuilt by the British in 1782 and remained in British control even years after the United States achieved independence. The British controlled this fort until 1796. The fort eventually fell into American hands and then was destroyed by the same British who built it in the year 1814 during the War of 1812. We're told this fortified site remained in ruins until 1839, when it was rebuilt as the fort which still stands today. Fort Ontario served as a medical hospital during World War I, was reopened for training during and after World War II, and also served as the only refugee center for Jewish refugees in the entire United States during World War II. Fort Ontario was restored throughout the 1950s and 1960s before being added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1970. The fort still stands today. Would you believe one of the first star forts ever built in the United States was constructed in the year 1758 and was founded in Rome, New York? This is known as Star Fort Stanwix. The epic star fort supposedly took only 4 years to complete and was charged with protecting one of the innermost trade routes of America at that time, known as the Oneida Carry. The smaller star fort encompasses only 16 acres of land, but what's remarkable is the fort that you see today is actually a rebuilt fort, simply an artistic interpretation based off analysis of the earlier foundations. We're told the first Fort Stanwix was constructed by the British to protect the trade route of Oneida, but it was sacked and destroyed, finally rebuilt by American troops prior to the War of Independence. In August of 1777, British forces intended to recapture Fort Stanwix, but eventually their massive siege was abandoned. The Star Fort was simply too difficult to capture. Star Fort Stanwix was also the site of two significant treaties, both known as the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, signed in 1768 and 1784, respectively. The current narrative tells us after 1828, Fort Stanwix was dismantled and the stones of the Star Fort were reused in nearby construction. The earthworks of the Star Fort were designated by Franklin D. Roosevelt as a national monument in the year 1935. However, the city of Rome, New York, was quite literally built on top of the foundations of the Star Fort. It took until the 1960s, but under pressure by Robert F. Kennedy, in a move not often seen in the United States of America, the Star Fort Stanwix was actually excavated, while downtown Rome, New York, built on top of the Star Fort Stanwix ruins, was systematically torn down, and the Star Fort was then rebuilt under a master plan from Kennedy and the Park Service. The plan was only approved in 1967, and the excavations of Star Fort Stanwix took until 1974. That year, the rebuilding process commenced. The rebuilt Star Fort Stanwix still stands today and is one of Upper New York's most visited historical sites. The next fort on our list is more of a myth than anything else. As we're told in the current narrative, Fort St. Andrews existed only for roughly 6 years. Yet, at the time of its completion, Fort St. Andrews was considered quite a remarkable feat of engineering and one of the finest new forts on New World soil. Fort St. Andrews was said to have been founded in 1736 by the British on Cumberland Island in Georgia. The Star Fort was considered to be a buffer between the northern occupied colonies and Spanish Florida. We're told Georgia was only officially colonized in 1732 under General James Oglethorpe. We're told the entirety of Georgia was considered a point of contention between the British and the Spanish, who both laid claim to the territory. James Oglethorpe was considered to have created at least 4 unique forts in Georgia at this time, with at least 2 of them being star forts, and Fort St. Andrews being the latter of those 2. Fort St. Andrews sat at Terrapin Point in the shape of a 4-pointed star, with inside walls roughly 65 feet in length and outer walls of roughly 130 feet in length. The fort was also palisaded and sat directly along the waterfront. By the year 1742, in the month of June, Fort St. Andrews was besieged by the Spanish, reduced to rubble, and then abandoned. Although the area was apparently reoccupied by the British, we're told the fort itself was never rebuilt, and the men in the area lived about the ruins for several years before being moved to other, more recently completed forts. With what we know, I could not find any further photographs of Fort St. Andrews. Another star fort which is seemingly barely holding on to its place in the historical narrative is a star fort known simply as the Star Fort, formerly known as Fort Alabama in Winchester, Virginia. We're told during the earliest days of the Civil War, Confederate troops began to reinforce, rebuild, and altogether construct new star forts. This is where the engineering of this particular type of architecture becomes so critical. While we almost exclusively think of star or bastion forts as a European creation, we have engineers on both sides of the American Civil War who we are told were able to construct or refurbish this particular design of fort. The Star Fort in Winchester was quite literally built on top of and within the town of Winchester. The town is thick with rolling hills that are almost indiscernible from the earthworks created for the Star Forts. There is so much history buried within this landscape, yet most of it has been allowed to become overgrown and undocumented, and finding proper photographs was very difficult. We're told a key junction of roads and railroads during the Civil War, Winchester, Virginia was also the center for nearly all banking, trade, and agriculture in the northern Shenandoah Valley. During the 1860s, Virginians built 10 forts and smaller fortified positions to block any United States Army attempts to seize Winchester. In such, we have multiple forts which may or may not have been star forts in the city of Winchester. However, we know Star Fort was, in fact, a star fort. Winchester was considered the worst, quote, war zone town during the Civil War, changing hands at least 70 times during the conflict, which is remarkable given we don't often hear this historic city mentioned in the mainstream narrative. Could Winchester have housed even more magnificent star forts which were purposefully destroyed and hidden during the Civil War? The next star fort is one that I've often heard mentioned in the mainstream, and this star fort has intrigued me since the first time that I've heard its unique name. This is Old 96 Star Fort, also known as 96 National Historic Site, and 96 Star Fort is 60 miles or 96 kilometers south of Greenville, South Carolina, although the origin of the name still remains a topic of debate. 96 was listed on the National Register in 1969. We're told the name 96 was first used to describe the distance in miles of the fort's location from the next major Cherokee town. Others propose the name derives from the indigenous people themselves, who had named it such based off the 9 tributaries of the Marion and Henley Creeks and the 6 tributaries of Thompson's Creek. Roughly 96 people lived in 96 during the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and the first battle of the war that was fought on South Carolina soil was fought at 96 in November of 1775. We're told the British seized control of this fort, rebuilt or reconstructed the fort, and 96 was then occupied by mostly Scottish and Irish workers that were considered loyal to the British Crown. The Continental Army of the United States repeatedly attempted to besiege the Star Fort 96 from the British in the year 1781, but the Americans failed due to the sheer size of the Bastion fort, at least according to the current narrative. 96 then remained relatively well known, but was allowed to become mostly overgrown before being cleared in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, 96 Star Fort is one of the more popular tourist locations in South Carolina. The Star Fort 96 and the surrounding historic site encompass roughly 1,022 acres of majestic land. We have saved the best for last. In 1799, Paul I of Russia, in one of the only moves that he made without the guidance of his mother Catherine the Great, signed a treaty formally establishing the Russian-American Company. The Russian-American Company sought the founding of star forts, establishing these forts as Russian bases for trade with the indigenous people, and to use these fortifications as locations to carry out the Russian colonization program, which involved introducing orphans to newly established Russian communities in America. Wow. The flag of the Russian-American Company was very similar to other flags that we've seen before, the double-headed eagle. During the height of the Russian-American Company, multiple large-scale forts were created on remote locations in Western America. One that still exists today, although partially in ruins, is the Russian Fort Elizabeth, also known as Pa'ulaula State Historical Site, or Fort Hippo, on the island of Kauai, in Hawaii. Star Fort Elizabeth is the last remaining Russian fortress in the entire state of Hawaii. There once were dozens. Star Fort Elizabeth once encompassed over 17 acres of land and was said to have been originally built in 1817. We're told the Russian-American Company suffered great losses, which eventually led to the company's downfall when King Kamehameha I of Hawaii united the islands. In an attempt to destabilize the Hawaiian Islands, the Russian-American Company constructed numerous forts on the island of Kauai, with Fort Elizabeth, by many accounts, being the largest and most robust. We also have Fortress Alexander and Fortress Barclay de Tolly, both built by the Russian-American Company, both of which are lost today, but each of these could have also been star or bastion forts. Fort Elizabeth was said to have been an irregular octagon, with walls roughly 300 to 400 feet in length, and the walls were roughly 20 feet tall. Incredible. Fort Elizabeth housed the first Orthodox Christian church on any of the Hawaiian Islands. We're told the fort fell under control of King Kamehameha by 1820, and Fort Elizabeth then remained in good condition through the 1840s, even being the location for revolts that were launched against King Kamehameha's kingdom, and later the Star Fort was used as a prison to house those who launched the revolt. The Star Fort was abandoned in 1853 and allowed to fall into disrepair. It was rediscovered, already overgrown, in 1862 when a survey was taken of the lost fort by American forces. In 1864, Star Fort Elizabeth was systematically dismantled, with the largest of the cannons actually being lost in the nearby bay. Today, the Star Fort remains just the foundations. However, you can see from these photographs just how epic and unique this star fortification really once was. One of the most written of campaigns in the entire 18th century was that of the British versus the French in America, which, according to the mainstream narrative, was the driving factor behind the founding of numerous star forts mentioned on today's list. One in particular was Fort Ligonier in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. This bastion, or star fortress, is another significant achievement which, through neglect, was allowed to become overgrown and abandoned. Eventually, the original star fort was lost, and what we see today is a reconstruction based around the original earth mounds and earthworks. Essentially, Star Fort Ligonier was constructed as part of the British campaign to reclaim Fort Duquesne in the year 1758. John Forbes was charged the daunting task of recapturing Star Fort Duquesne, and thus he built a series of advanced forts along a new road he founded which cut through Pennsylvania towards the west. Fort Ligonier was the last British fortress before the French Fort Duquesne, and Fort Ligonier was officially founded in 1758 and was then known as Loyalhanna. The fort encompasses roughly 15 acres of land. We're told George Washington passed through Fort Ligonier on his way to capture Fort Duquesne for the British. By November 25th of 1758, Fort Duquesne fell into British hands. Fort Duquesne was then torn down and rebuilt as Fort Pitt, and the land surrounding the area was then called Pittsburgh. And John Forbes would also rename the Star Fort of Loyalhanna as Star Fort Ligonier, named after the commander-in-chief of his unit in Great Britain. However, we're told by 1766, this beautiful Star Fort Ligonier was abandoned. We're told the Star Fort was only rebuilt in the 20th century, and only after a significant campaign to have it restored. Many had forgotten that Star Fort Ligonier ever existed, but the site was meticulously renovated and is now part of the National Register of Historic Places, which it was added to in 1975. Another mysterious star fortress, which came to us courtesy of the Union troops during the Civil War, according to the narrative, yet this fortress seems to bear a much earlier history, is Star Fort Negley in Nashville, Tennessee. Fort Negley was considered the largest inland fortress ever constructed during the entire American Civil War, and the Star Fort sat just 2 miles away from Center City, Nashville. While the overall defensive structure may have been a bit larger, we're told the Star Fort itself encompassed an area of 180,000 square feet. Fort Negley was built in 1862 by the design of James St. Clair Morton. This fortress was also added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1975, and this date seems to be the common time period when most of these forts had been refurbished, the history recalculated, and these forts had been cleared. These pieces of history were finally then opened up to the public as attractions rather than misunderstood and overgrown early defensive structures. We're told Nashville and the surrounding area had at least 2 large star fortresses which protected the city during the Civil War. These forts were first occupied by Confederate soldiers. When the 2 fortresses guarding Nashville fell to the Union in February of 1862, Nashville was abandoned by Confederate soldiers and quickly occupied by the North. Now, take the current narrative with a grain of salt, as always, but the Civil War, as we know, had 2 sides. One side was made out to be one way, and the other side was made out to be almost completely the opposite. Fort Negley, built by the Union after they captured the abandoned Nashville, was built almost exclusively using slave labor. We're told the Union used over 2,760 people of color to construct Fort Negley, with many being forcibly conscripted to do the work. Others, who had fled from what they thought were harsher conditions further south to the newly Union-occupied Nashville, were mortified to find out they would be forced into months of intensive labor if they ever wanted to see their freedom. This was the order of the Union Army, and may help us better understand that no side is without evil in most major conflicts. The fort was named for the Union Army commander James S. Negley. Fort Negley saw combat only once during the Battle of Nashville in 1864. During Reconstruction, the fort was used as a meeting place for clandestine organizations, according to Marcus B. Toney. Fort Negley was due to be completely restored in the 1930s after decades of being allowed to become overgrown. However, with the outbreak of World War II, restoration projects were abandoned. The fort eventually fell into disrepair. However, the land surrounding Fort Negley became home to numerous baseball fields and eventually a minor league team. Fort Negley has been restored multiple times since the early 2000s, and restorations are said to be continuing today. After discussing Fort Negley in Nashville, we must also mention Fort Henry, which was one of the original star forts that protected Nashville. Fort Henry was a 5-sided star fort which covered over 10 acres of land. The fort was strategically placed roughly 1 mile away from and overlooking Panther Creek. All of this arose in roughly 1861 when Isham G. Harris, governor of Tennessee, appointed Tennessee's official state attorney to oversee the founding of new fortifications built upon important locations to indigenous people at the meeting of major water junctions and upon the tallest hills and mounds alongside the major waterways of Tennessee. Fort Henry was considered the second star fort of Tennessee. By July of 1861, the fort was near completion, and by 1862, Fort Henry braced for a possible Union invasion. We're told the Confederates employed an early form of torpedo in the defense of Fort Henry, also known as a naval minefield. We're told the Battle of Fort Henry was one of the most important battles of the entire Civil War, a decisive shifting of the tides, and Fort Henry remained an important structure to the Union even after the battle had done ample damage to the original Star Fort. Now let's talk about the possible covering of inherited tracts. Fort Henry remained in relative decent condition, even being restored. Let's say it could have been preserved. However, in the 1930s, the state of Tennessee chose to dam the Tennessee River right next to Fort Henry, creating the man-made Kentucky Lake. Kentucky Lake, if you would believe it, completely engulfed and submerged the Star Fort Henry and the surrounding area. What remains of Star Fort Henry is completely underwater today. The next fort is so remote, it is considered to be lost, yet it's another star or bastion fortress that was being founded deep within the heart of Virginia. We're told Star Fort Johnston, also known as Star Fort Geary, was a Civil War era, mostly earthen star fort, which was built atop the peak of a mountain just west of Leesburg, Virginia. Information here is scarce at best, but Star Fort Johnston was said to have stood roughly 670 feet in the air atop Mount Catoctin. The fort was built in the design of a four-pointed star, with the arm of each point measuring roughly 110 feet in length. This was a significant sized fortress. We're told the fortress was actually abandoned by Confederate soldiers and occupied by Union federal agents who then used it as a command post. However, as Leesburg became increasingly distant from the conflicts of the Civil War, the Star Fort Johnston was said to have been abandoned by the Union soldiers. However, have you ever heard of Camp David? The secretive retreat for the President of the United States was actually founded atop Mount Catoctin, the former location of the lost Star Fort in the 1930s. Furthermore, the ruins of this Star Fort, if they still exist, would be located throughout private property on Fort Johnston Road, mainly in the area that is said to contain Camp David. We can only begin to speculate why this location was chosen and what may lie hidden just beneath the surface. Another radical bastion fortress, which seldom gets the credit it is due, is Fort St. Frederick, built along Lake Champlain in New York. The fort was French in origin, although it may have been a joint effort between the French and the indigenous people, as the coast of Lake Champlain played a crucial role in Indigenous American life. The fort sits close to the modern town of Crown Point, New York, and it is also just across a small portion of the lake from the state of Vermont. Fort St. Frederick was built in 1734 by the French, and it served as one of their first strongholds in New York. The fort was massive. For example, we're told the walls alone were 12 feet thick. It was constructed in hopes of deterring the British from trying to settle around Lake Champlain. However, by 1759, Fort St. Frederick was sacked and destroyed by over 10,000 British soldiers under the command of Geoffrey Amherst. In this sacking, the besieging of the Star Fort, we actually have the ruins of this Star Fort St. Frederick being incorporated into the next Star Fort on our list. Fort Crown Point was constructed in roughly 1759 by the British at the Narrows of Lake Champlain, and it was built using the ruins of the French Star Fort St. Frederick. Fort Crown Point was situated on the land that would become the border between the states of New York and Vermont. Now, knowing what we know of earthworks, both military and indigenous in America, we are told remarkably, Star Fort Crown Point was the largest earthwork fort ever built in the United States. Knowing what we know about the current narrative, is it at all questionable that we're told Fort Crown Point was built in part by orders of Jeffrey Amherst simply as a means to keep his men busy throughout the harsh New York winter, were somehow led to believe the construction of the largest earthen fort in American history was somehow a remedial task. We're told the construction was supervised by Israel Putnam, and many, including archaeologist David Starbuck, consider Star Fort Crown Point to be the greatest British military installation ever raised in North America. As the largest earthen fort in the United States, we must also consider the entirety of the earthworks were lined with massive stone buildings as well. This was a proper star fort. While Fort Crown Point never saw battle, a massive fire was said to have broke out here in April of 1773. And in this fire, we're told somehow nearly all the stone buildings were reduced to rubble. In one of the earliest skirmishes of the Revolutionary War, Seth Warner and the Green Mountain Boys, an American militia, captured the ruins of Star Fort Crown Point. The majority of the cannons that remained were then transferred by the Americans to Boston for the defense of Boston Harbor. We're told following 1780, the United States declared zero need for the fortress and allowed this star fort to fall into disrepair. The large earthen walls of the fort are still visible today in the 21st century, and the star fort ruins, along with the few remaining buildings, were declared a National Historic Landmark in 1968. The fort, when it stood in all of its original glory, was visited by Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and listen to this, George Washington, which isn't the remarkable part, but rather, we're told that Star Fort Crown Point is quoted as being the furthest north that George Washington ever traveled in the United States. I find that to be absolutely remarkable. The next fortress, also in New York, is Fort Ticonderoga, formerly known as Fort Carillon. Fort Ticonderoga was built as part of the action of the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. You have to love the names used here, as the capturing and inheriting of these star forts truly must have been like theater in the 18th century. Fort Ticonderoga was built from 1755 through 1757, while others claim it was still being built in 1758 when it first saw battle. I'm almost scared to share these numbers with you, but according to the official Wikipedia page, we're told the larger earthworks of the Star Fortress Ticonderoga once encompassed over 21,000 acres, or roughly 34 square miles of land. While we can see the tip of this larger star fort today, from earlier presentations and depictions of this star fort, it appears much of the earthworks have now been allowed to become overgrown and or incorporated into the forest surrounding this top structure. Which begs the question, how deep does Star Fort Ticonderoga truly go? Ticonderoga is Iroquois, meaning the junction of two great waterways, and Fort Ticonderoga was a location for what many consider to be the most important battle of the 7 Years' War. In 1758, over 16,000 British troops attempted to besiege the Star Fort before being repelled by a French force of only 4,000 men. The Star Fort is credited with being the decisive factor in this battle. In 1759, the British returned with more advanced technology, and the French were then expelled from Fort Ticonderoga. In May of 1775, the Star Fort was captured by the American militia known as the Green Mountain Boys, and again, the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga were transported by sea back to Bastion. The British attempted to recapture the Fort Ticonderoga multiple times, but were eventually expelled from this area for good in 1781. In 1785, Fort Ticonderoga was given to the state of New York, who in return donated the massive property to the colleges of Columbia and Union, respectively. However, by 1820, the colleges, who had excavated the fortress completely, then sold the lands to William Ferris Pell. The Pell family being one of old money, whose members included the first governor of Louisiana and senators from Rhode Island. This Pell family then used the property of Star Fort Ticonderoga as a private getaway for family events and close friends. When the railroad brought the connection from Fort Ticonderoga to New York City, the former Star Fort was then flooded with tourists who had been awaiting to see this miraculous construction. It opened as a public historic site in 1909. An association to protect the Star Fort was founded in 1931 by the Pells, and Fort Ticonderoga was designated as a National Historic Landmark, and today is a major point of excursion for any tourists who travel to Upper New York State. The next fort is one which definitely needs to be in the back of our minds if we're ever in the state of New York. While the other Star Forts mentioned have at least a little bit of history that's been told about them, Fort Brewerton, on the other hand, has very little mentioned in the sense of a narrative, and much of the details regarding the construction phase of this wonderful Bastion fort are still up for debate. We're told Fort Brewerton in Oswego County, New York, was absolutely amazing as far as the architecture. It was said to be in the form of an 8-pointed star, meaning 16 unique sides, and the fort was nearly 500 feet across. Remarkably, the star fort was topped with earthen walls, which rose 5 feet high, seemingly indicating that we have earthen walls here as well as brick and stone. The earthen walls added on top of the stone to create an awe-inspiring star fort. From the earthen section of the walls rose further log palisades, and within the former walls of this star fort once stood multiple block houses, stone houses, powder magazines, as well as stone wells for water and buildings for the storage of food. However, the real kicker is that all of this, each of the 16 sides of this star fort, was said to have been surrounded by a moat which measured roughly 10 feet thick and 10 feet deep. This was a star fortress similar to the massive Fort Monroe. Star Fort Brewerton was said to have been built simply to protect Albany and the port of Oswego, and yet according to the current narrative, Fort Brewerton was basically forgotten until scholars and historians from New York argued for this location to be added to the National Register of Historic Places, which it was in 1973. Furthermore, we're told the original Star Fort, most of the buildings and the materials were reused in the surrounding towns, and most of what once constituted the Star Fort was built on top of as this location was further developed. While Fort Brewerton sounds as if it were one of the most complex star forts to ever exist in America, it was abandoned, seemingly on purpose, and the history about this fort is more a mystery than anything else. Let's talk about Fort Wood, aka the Star Fort which the Statue of Liberty sits on top of. Star Fort Wood has a wild history. First of all, according to the narrative, the island which the Star Fort sits on top of has at least 3 known names throughout history, with the first being Bedloe. However, even before this, the island was home to many Lenape, who created great earthworks on the island, as well as great mounds of oyster and other shells. For this reason, early colonists actually called this island the Great Oyster Island. Great Oyster Island changed hands when New York was handed over from the Dutch to British control. Great Oyster Island was eventually purchased by Isaac Bedloe in 1667. By 1732, still in Bedloe's family, the island was sold to 2 European merchants before being commandeered by the city of New York for use during the smallpox outbreak. In 1746, Archibald Kennedy purchased the island and constructed a massive stone lighthouse here. Yet, by 1753, we have still surviving advertisements that claim Bedloe's Island, which is referred to alternately as the Island of Love, was open for rental. Read between the lines, but in 1758, the corporation of the city of New York bought the island for £1,000 and transformed Bedloe's Island into a plague house. When the British invaded New York during the Revolutionary War, the entirety of Bedloe Island, by that time called Love Island, was burned down. In 1800, Love Island was ceded by the state of New York to the federal government, along with Governor's Island and Ellis Island. All 3 islands were supposed to have intricate star forts constructed on top of them for the defense of New York. Construction of the star fort on Love Island in the shape of an 11-pointed star began in 1806 and was said to have been completed in 1811. It was built strictly to protect New York from British invasion. It's as if they knew the War of 1812 was coming. Fort Wood was named such after the War of 1812 and retains that name until today. Star Fort Wood was actually due to be expanded upon even further as part of the United States' third system of fortifications, but this idea was later abandoned. Remarkably, the Star Fort under the Statue of Liberty is not the first Fort Wood, but rather when Love Island was chosen as the location for the base of the statue in the 1880s, it was because of the Star Fort. The Star Fort was said to, at that time, have been deteriorating and somewhat ruined, so the substantial stone walls of the original fortress were dug out of what they say were layers of mud. They were reshaped, and a new Star Fortress was quite literally built out of the foundations of the first one. The Star Fort we see today is considered to be simply a pedestal and does not serve any defensive purpose, nor is it said to be the same design as the original Star Fort would, and yet Love Island was renamed Liberty Island in 1956, and today it is from this location that one of the most important pieces of American culture took shape. The next fortress, also in New York, is known as Fort J. This massive star fort still exists today and is quite the feat of engineering, to say the least. Fort J was built in 3 unique stages, the first in 1794, the second in 1806, and the third in 1833. Under the United States Army Corps of Engineers, this sandstone, brick, and granite masterpiece truly took shape. It is situated on Governor's Island in New York Harbor and was named for the founding father, John Jay. From 1806 until 1904, this star fort was known as Fort Columbus before the name was changed back to Fort J. The first earthwork on the site of Fort J dates back to 1776, and it appears, like with many other star forts, Fort J arose from earlier built earth mounds. The British actually occupied this location following the Revolutionary War, further strengthening the earthwork before abandoning the structure in 1783. The earthen star fort was then seemingly forgotten, and the fort fell into disrepair and was not documented again until 1794, when it was founded by American forces, fully overgrown and dilapidated. It was ordered at this time to be reconstructed as a star fort. By 1797, the work began, and by 1806, the earthen fort was fully reinforced with granite and thousands of bricks. The entire star fort was expanded upon and further enlarged by Jonathan Williams and was said to be the key star fort of the second system of United States coastal fortifications. We're told the entire Fort J was once surrounded by a dry moat, which was improved upon from earlier designs. Fort J was built in a Greek revival style, and according to the narrative, this made it more difficult to maintain. Eventually, other installations built near this star fort and the antiquated equipment decreased the strategic importance of Star Fort J. In 1878, as part of a service-wide cost-cutting effort, the United States Army relocated many of its administrative functions from rented quarters in large cities to neighboring Army posts. In New York City, nearly all Army functions in the city were relocated to Fort J at this time. By November of 1964, after a year of study to identify ways to downsize Department of Defense installations, the U.S. Army announced they would be closing Fort J. Star Fort Union, now known as the Fort Union National Monument, is a former massive bastion fortress in the state of New Mexico. Fort Union dates back at least to the year 1851, although the foundations of this site could be even older, as we're told the historic site of Fort Union encompasses the history of at least 3 former forts. In 1851, under orders of the government of New Mexico, Edwin V. Sumner was tasked with fortifying New Mexico. He decided to move the base of his camp and the base of operations in New Mexico to further along the Santa Fe Trail. In this new location, roughly 25 miles northeast of Las Vegas, Fort Union was founded. The first fortress was mainly used as a trade post and may or may not have been in a star fort formation. The second fort built at this location was said to be much more advanced, possibly the early star fort formation, and this was built in 1862, and this design was improved upon beginning in 1863, transforming this location into the massive and sprawling star fort of history. The Star Fort installation took roughly 6 years to complete and was the most extensive in all the territory. It included not only a military post, but a separate quartermaster depot with warehouses, corrals, shops, offices, and additional living quarters. Fort Union, following the Civil War, again was transformed into one of the largest trade hubs in America. The supply depot continued to flourish until roughly 1879, when the Santa Fe Railroad replaced the Santa Fe Trail as the principal means of commerce. By 1891, the Star Fort Union had outlived its usefulness and was apparently completely abandoned at this time. From 1891 onward, Star Fort Union fell into disrepair, and much of the original Star Fortress is unrecognizable today. Fort Morgan is one of the most important structures to have ever served Alabama, said to have been constructed from 1819 through 1834, which just so happens to be the exact same year Star Fort Monroe was being constructed in Virginia. However, we're told Fort Morgan was actually built on the foundations of the earlier Fort Boyer, which was built in April of 1813 after the departure of the Spanish. This fort existed at Mobile Point in Mobile, Alabama, and was named after the colonel who completed it, John Boyer. The British attempted to besiege the Star Fort Boyer, first in 1814 unsuccessfully, before a second attempt in early 1815 found success. However, the Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814, and when news reached Fort Boyer, the British abandoned the fortress after laying waste to it. From the foundations of Fort Boyer, Fort Morgan was constructed. We're told the fort went through a number of lead architects before its completion in 1834. The Star Fort Morgan proved to be one of the most successful star forts of the 19th century, and when it served the Confederate Army, it is written that all 17 blockade vessels sent out of Mobile Bay made it safely, as Star Fort Morgan provided ample cover. We're told Fort Morgan fell only after nearby Fort Gaines was captured in August of 1864. When the Union Army captured Fort Morgan, a massive brick citadel located in the center of the fort was then torn down, brick by brick, and these bricks were said to have been used to repair the outer walls of the fortress. Star Fort Morgan received additional batteries throughout the 19th century. However, hurricanes in 1906 and in July of 1916 caused great damage at Fort Morgan along Officers Row. Fort Morgan was used as a training center and radio transmission center in World War I. In April of 1942, Fort Morgan was again reoccupied during World War II. Fort Morgan was turned over to the state of Alabama in 1946 and seized all Army operations by 1947. Fort Morgan was made a historic landmark in 1960 and still stands in all of its glory today. Fort Gaines is a historic five-sided star fort, also in Mobile, Alabama. Built in 1821, just meters away from the Gulf of Mexico, we're told Fort Gaines was the work of architect Joseph G. Totten. This fort is another which was said to have guarded the entrance to Mobile Bay during the Civil War, and it is considered one of the best preserved fortresses of the 19th century. The fort has the original cannons that were used in the Civil War battle. 5 of the pre-Civil War brick buildings in the interior courtyard still stand. Fort Gaines also has an operational blacksmith shop and kitchens, as well as an intricate tunnel system leading to the fortified corner bastions, and similar features are found in the below-ground quarters. This 5-sided star fortress resembles what many today might consider to be a baseball field. And it's interesting how the earliest forms of that game seem to be played in and around early mounds and fortresses. But I digress. Fort Gaines was only slightly modernized for the Spanish-American War. However, most major construction you see today at Fort Gaines is said to be Civil War era or earlier. The fort sits on the east end of Dauphin Island, an island that was heavily involved in the Battle of Mobile Bay. While not overgrown by any means, Fort Gaines is considered one of the most endangered star forts in all of America due to the threat from hurricanes. However, Fort Gaines still stands today with much of the original architecture from 1821. It is one of America's most well-preserved star forts. The intricacies of early American star forts and even their true origin is often a topic of debate among scholars and historians alike. In 1754, we have the founding of Fort Cumberland in what is today Cumberland, Maryland. Not only was Star Fort Cumberland the epicenter for finance and trade during the 7 Years' War, but it is also the birthplace for what many people consider to be the military career of George Washington. We're told Star Fort Cumberland arose from a massive trading post created along Nema-Collins Trail, an ancient indigenous trail improved upon by the British. The fort was meant to act as a permanent installation to aid those traveling Nema-Collins path, and by all reports, Fort Cumberland was rather large. What began as a palisaded small fort quickly evolved into a multi-layered star fort with earthen walls said to be upwards of 20 feet thick. Beneath the ground at Fort Cumberland, we're told, sat a cornucopia of interconnected tunnels, some of which still remain today. One can be found under the Emmanuel Church in Cumberland. The full extent of the underground tunnels at the fort has never been excavated in modern times. Fort Cumberland became infamous as the location where British troops retreated after they failed to capture Fort Duquesne. And here at Fort Cumberland, Washington clashed with leaders of the Maryland forces, eventually rallying the British troops behind his cause. We're told most of the original Star Fort is completely gone today, as the city of Cumberland was quite literally built directly on top of and out of the ruins of Fort Cumberland. We can't mention Fort Cumberland without mentioning Fort Duquesne, which eventually became known as Fort Pitt, today the site of the major Pennsylvanian city of Pittsburgh. This is one of the most quintessential star forts in American history. Star Fort Duquesne was founded by the French at the conflux of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, being completed in 1754. However, this strategic location was already well known to both French and British traders as an important location for indigenous people. As the French constructed multiple forts throughout Pennsylvania, with Fort Duquesne being the most robust, the British also began forming their own line of fortifications in the region. Fort Duquesne was an advanced star fort which the French held successfully until the British Forbes expedition, which captured and apparently then burnt down Fort Duquesne. However, just 3 years later, a brand new star fort begins to appear on maps as Fort Pitt, said to be a bastion fortress quite literally built out of the foundations of Fort Duquesne. Yet, according to the British and modern academia, Fort Pitt was a similar, yet entirely unique design when compared to Fort Duquesne, and Fort Pitt was said to have been built a few hundred feet away from the earlier star fort's foundations. Fort Pitt was the headquarters for the Western Theater of the Revolutionary War, and while abandoned shortly thereafter, Fort Pitt was reoccupied during the War of 1812. Eventually, the star fort fell into disuse, and the land and most of the stone from the fort was incorporated into the construction of the city of Pittsburgh. It wasn't until the 20th century that the city of Pittsburgh commissioned true archaeological excavation of the original Fort Pitt. Afterward, a majority of the fort was reconstructed and reopened, giving modern visitors at the location, now known as Point State Park, a sense of the sheer size and magnitude of the original Star Fort. This is one of the most visited tourist attractions in all of Pittsburgh. The penultimate fort on our list is Fort Mifflin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Right off the bat, Fort Mifflin was constructed on Mud Island, also known as the Deep Water Island. A very interesting title indeed. However, the nature of the construction of Fort Mifflin is far more deep-reaching than that. We're told the original Fort Mifflin was built in Philadelphia in 1681 following a grant from the British Crown to William Penn, and the city of Philadelphia rose around the fort. What's more intriguing is that William Penn, a Quaker, did not believe in violence, and so we are told the first rendition of Fort Mifflin, while most likely a star fort built with earth and palisades, it was not used for defense. Due to the Quaker position on warfare, we're told Fort Mifflin actually prospered while other forts crumbled, and Fort Mifflin was not only the main hub of trade in Pennsylvania, but Fort Mifflin actually had its own distinct flag, known worldwide, and was considered the richest British port in the New World by the 1740s. At this time, French and Spanish pirates and privateers looked to conquer Fort Mifflin and reap the profits. This is when a young Benjamin Franklin united the Quaker community to reinforce the fort as well as commence the building of new war ships. The Star Fort Mifflin then grew rapidly, with these earthen forts surrounding much of the area of occupied Philadelphia. However, following the 7 Years' War, the defenses of Philadelphia fell into disuse and were abandoned, as the focus of Philadelphia was again on trade. Philadelphia regained its status as Britain's largest port in the New World. Hoping to reinforce the defenses, a survey of Mud Island was conducted in 1771. However, it was only after the signing of the Declaration of Independence that the second Fort Mifflin was begun. The Philadelphia Committee of Public Safety restarted these renovations, and the fort was completed in 1776. The British took control of Philadelphia in September of 1777, and they were said to have completely destroyed Fort Mifflin at this time. The original designer of Fort Mifflin was a British man, and he actually helped lead the expedition to besiege Fort Mifflin in 1777. Fort Mifflin was said to have experienced the heaviest bombardment of any fort during the American Revolutionary War, and Bastion Fort Mifflin never again saw military action. Of the original Fort Mifflin, only the white stone walls of the fort survive today, and the pockmarks in these stone walls is evidence of the intensity of the British bombardment of 1777, sometimes referred to as the Battle for Mud Island. The ruins of the second Fort Mifflin laid relatively barren and became overgrown until it was rebuilt by American forces in 1794. The fort is named for Thomas Mifflin, the first post-independence governor of Pennsylvania. The U.S. Congress used to meet in Philadelphia until roughly the year 1800, and due to this reason, Fort Mifflin was always well garrisoned. During the Civil War, the Union used Fort Mifflin to house Confederate prisoners of war, and between 1866 and 1876, the Corps of Engineers repaired and then modernized Fort Mifflin. From 1876 through 1884, the Philadelphia District Office of the Corps of Engineers took over the custodial responsibility of Fort Mifflin. In 1954, Fort Mifflin was decommissioned as an active military post. The apparent final store fortress on our list, and again, this list was compiled from the current narrative presentation of the history, from Wikipedia pages, from architectural forums dedicated to the American forts. I truly believe we have not exhausted all our results in this list, and while I do believe there are dozens more star forts out there, the last we will cover today is Castillo de San Marcos, or St. Mark's Castle in St. Augustine, Florida. This star fort is the oldest masonry fortress of any kind still standing in the United States of America, and was founded the whole way back in 1692. St. Mark's Castle encompasses over 20 acres of land within its ancient star fort walls. This star fort arose from an order by Governor Francisco de la Guarda y de la Vega and was designed by Ignacio Daza. The fort stood as a remarkable feat of engineering, nearly unmatched in the New World, and it wasn't until 1763 that the British gained control of Florida with the Treaty of Paris. However, St. Mark's Castle was transferred back to the Spanish in 1783 with the Peace of Paris. This amazing star fortress was then ceded to the United States of America, with most of Florida, in 1821, and the star fortress you see today was renamed Fort Marion. Fort Marion was home to numerous campaigns to enslave Indigenous Americans, as well as heavily involved in the Civil War, where this fortress changed hands multiple times. It remained in usage by American troops until 1924, when it was then designated a national monument of the United States, and continued to serve for another 9 years until 1933, when it was decommissioned after 251 years of continuous military usage. Owing to its strategic cannon placement and the star-shaped design, the star fort was never breached or taken by force throughout its over 250-year history. Because the Spanish offered freedom to enslaved people, thousands fled away from British North America to the star fort Castillo de San Marcos and were there granted freedom by the Spanish authorities. According to the narrative, directly outside the fortified walls of the star fort Castillo de San Marcos was formed the first permanent African American community in America, who built their own large fortress known as Fort Mose. When the star fort of St. Mark closed in 1933, it was transferred to the National Park Service and has been one of Florida's most popular tourist attractions ever since. So there you have it, the comprehensive list, according to the current narrative, of every bastion or star fortress that ever existed in the United States of America. As you can tell, I am of the belief that we probably have dozens, if not over 100 more fortifications that are very similar to this, or fortifications that may have been identified as star forts in the past, but they have been overgrown, they have been rebuilt, they have been repurposed into other structures, and the history may have been forgotten or purposefully retold. Now, of these structures, we can see many of them were formed on the ruins of ancient indigenous mounds and other indigenous places of importance. And that only adds fuel to the fire that these sites are far older than the current narrative gives them credit for. Again, today's video was meant to be a comprehensive list of all the star forts in the current narrative. However, I do believe that there are many more out there that could fit this criteria. This is just the history that we've been given, the history that we are supposed to accept. And I thought the fortifications themselves, looking through this list, we can get a better idea of just how intricate these early designs in America truly was. Because imagining the technology, or lack thereof, that was used to construct these star forts, and then seeing how they have lasted for hundreds of years, we can only imagine what they looked like when they were first completed and how these star forts really came into fruition. But again, I thank you so much if you have stuck here for the entire video. If you are not already, definitely consider subscribing to the channel, as I have hundreds of other videos now with thousands, tens of thousands of photographs, old world photographs, pre-1900 photographs, photographs from before the turn of the century, where we look at technology, we look at fortifications, we look at structures, buildings, anomalous things from our history. So if that is something that interests you, definitely consider subscribing to my channel and checking out some of my other work. If you have stuck with me for this entire video, being one of the longest videos I have ever made, I would definitely love to hear about it down below. I want to know which star fort stood out to you the most, because your thoughts on the matter definitely add to the narrative that we're looking to spark. And again, I can't wait to hear what you have to say in the comment section down below. But for now, I'm going to chime out, and we will talk more about this subject matter on the next video. I will see you there.